Thank you, Joe, for your ministry and music. Did Moses know what he was signing up for? Did Moses know what he was signing up for? Did Moses know what he was agreeing to when he said he would lead the people of Israel? Now, we should remember that, and we probably remember quite well, he was very reluctant and resisted and even rejected God's call upon his life at the burning bush. But he eventually did go. He followed that call of God on his life to lead the people of Israel. So I begin with the question, did Moses know what he was signing up for? And as we think about his leading so far that we've seen in the book of Exodus, after God had called Moses at the burning bush to lead his people out of Egypt, Moses and Aaron relayed the words of God and the signs of God to the people of Israel. It says this in Exodus 4:31, "And the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped." So initially, the first time Moses and Aaron go to the people, it's a very good response. They receive them. They receive the words of God and even bow and worship. But then after Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh for the first time, Pharaoh makes the suffering and the labors of the Israelite slaves harder. It says this in Exodus 5:20 through 21. We see Israel's response to Moses and Aaron. It says, "They met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them as they came out from Pharaoh. And they said to them, 'The Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants and put a sword in their hand to kill us.'" So the people of Israel's welcome and their worship of God turns to accusations against Moses and Aaron. It switches real quick. But it continues as God speaks to Moses again and reminds him of what he would do, and he gives him words to communicate to Israel. In Exodus 6:6, we get this response. It says, "Moses spoke thus to the people of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses because of their broken spirit and harsh slavery." So Moses brings the word of God to them, and they not only reject him, but they reject God outright. Well, 9 plagues happen. And before the 10th, God gives to Moses instructions for Israel concerning the Passover meal. And if you look at the end of verse 27 into verse 28, we get this response of the people of Israel. It says, "And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the people of Israel went and did so as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did." So from what the author of Exodus has let us in on, okay, we're not getting every single detail, we're not getting every single conversation that took place in this time, but from what the author of Exodus is letting us in on, what he has recorded in the scriptures, we've gotten to see a group that Moses and Aaron are leading and how they respond to these leaders. It began with acceptance, respect, submissiveness, but when things didn't go as were expected, when things got rough, they turned on him. They turned on their leaders. They rejected them. They wouldn't listen to them. After God's awesome working in the plagues, there seems to be a renewed willingness to listen to God and Moses and Aaron as Israel listens when it comes to the Passover. But as we especially think about these last couple of studies in Exodus, especially last week, okay, we have seen Israel complaining, grumbling. It went back to the Red Sea, Israel questioning, accusing Moses at the Red Sea. And we've seen in the last 2 studies in Exodus, Moses and Aaron getting complained against, grumbled against because of the people of Israel's thirst and their hunger. And most recently last week, I want to zero in on just one part of our passage from last week. It said this, "And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness." Every single Israelite, okay, this is a 2 million plus group of people, they all were upset toward Moses and Aaron. It says, "and the whole congregation of the people of Israel." Okay, it wasn't just a few rebels in the group. It wasn't just a cluster here or a cluster there. It wasn't just one family, but all the people of Israel were griping, moaning, grumbling against these 2 leaders. And I wonder if Moses, coming back to our original question, I wonder if Moses had any clue that this would be the case, that this would be the future when he reluctantly followed the call of God on his life. Maybe he was concerned about Pharaoh. How in the world would they get out of Egypt? But did he realize how difficult the people he was being called to lead would be? And today, this continues in our passage. Today, we consider Israel's complaints against their leader and how this leader handles such complaints. So that will be our theme for our text for this evening. I don't have it up on the screen, but Exodus 17, 1 through 7 is our text in case you'd like to follow along in your Bible. Exodus 17, 1 through 7. We'll have the scripture on the screen. But our theme, our passage, another complaining passage, our theme is this: Israel complains again against their leader, and we see how this leader handles such complaints. Israel complains again against their leader, and we see how this leader handles such complaints. So our passage begins by showing the cause. And I have this in quotes as there's an even deeper, even spiritual cause, but we see the physical, outward cause of their complaints. We get this in Exodus 17:1. It says, all the congregation, the people of Israel, moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. Here's the cause: but there was no water for the people to drink. Israel moves yet another time, and yet another time it is to a place that is barren. Okay, they've been to places like this in the past, and it's a place where Israel thirsts for water. There's no water, there's nothing for them to drink in this place, and this leads to the complaints of the people. And the form they take is that Israel goes at it with their leader. If you look with me at the beginning of verse 2, it says, therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. Okay, the word quarreled here is a new word. Okay, we're going to see the repeated word for their complaints in just a moment. It comes again in this passage. But here we get the word quarreled, a new word, and this is a word that is speaking of strife, of contention, of opposition. More specifically, it is a word used for legal cases, speaking of a dispute in court. So Israel is opposing their leader. They are opposing Moses, finding fault in him with the lack of water as they demand, give us water to drink. They're thirsty. They can't find water. And the beginning of verse 2 boils down to Israel saying, this is your fault, Moses. You're at fault. You are to blame for this. They are bringing a charge against their leader. Okay, we see this in this word, quarreled, and in their complaint, give us water to drink. They're bringing a charge against this leader, and it's good to pause and consider what they're saying, consider the situation, and we see here that what Israel is finding fault with Moses is not a valid claim. Okay, so them quarreling with him, them bringing a charge against him, finding fault concerning water, Moses isn't to blame. Okay, he hasn't done any wrongdoing. Okay, as we think about leaders, Moses is their leader. Leaders aren't sinless. They're not above others, and we shouldn't think that they can't be addressed or approached when in the wrong. But here, as we think about Moses as their leader, he's not at fault. He's done nothing wrong. Okay, leaders can be falsely accused. Leaders can be seen as in the wrong or blamed when they have done nothing sinful, just like what is happening with Moses as the leader of Israel. Moses is not in the wrong, but rather Israel is in the wrong with their complaints here. And we see Moses' initial response. We're going to get an even greater response, but his initial response is that he questions the people's complaints. Look with me again at verse 2. It says, therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? I want to zero in on this first question that Moses asks as he responds, why do you quarrel with me? He's asking, why do you fight with me? Why do you oppose me? Why do you bring this charge against me? His question shows that he doesn't agree with what they're doing. Okay, he doesn't agree with it. And as we think about his response here, that he responds initially with this, it's an acceptable response. He doesn't get heated in anger. He doesn't go ballistic on them. He doesn't start calling them names, but he questions them to show that what they're doing is wrong. Okay? What they're doing is not right. But we see that being called into question doesn't stop them. So he says, why do you quarrel with me? He's showing this isn't right. But yet this question doesn't stop them as Israel continues on, and Israel accuses Moses of premeditated murder. Exodus 17:3 continues on with this complaint. It says, but the people thirsted there for water. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst. Here we get that repeated word that we've seen in the last two counts, and I don't have it highlighted on the screen for you, but it's that word grumbled. Okay, we've seen this word, same word that we've had in the past, grumbled, that they were complaining, they're murmuring against their leaders, is what this literally means. And here they say that he has delivered them from Egypt for the purpose of killing them all. Okay, he says, they say, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us? They're saying the purpose of him bringing them, delivering them out of Egypt is just to kill them in the wilderness. And we've seen, this might sound familiar, and it should, because we saw this last week. Exodus 16:3, very similar to what they said there. Exodus 16:3, and the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. And then here's the similar phrase, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So Israel accused Moses and Aaron of the same exact thing in the past. And as we think about Israel and this accusing, okay, where they're going with their complaint, they knew in the past what the cause or what the purpose was of Moses and Aaron bringing them out of Egypt. They know why they have been brought out. So they have become irrational in their thirst. They've jumped to ridiculous conclusions in their thirst. They are accusing Moses of something atrocious, as they've even escalated it from last week, as they say here in our passage. They say, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children? So they go to even the lengths of saying, you're trying to kill our children in this. So it's not only that the Israelites find fault here with their leaders because of something they need, but they add in lies. Okay, they make themselves to believe falsely. How quickly our complaints, so I think we can relate, how our complaints can be twisted even in our own minds to believe things, to think things that we know aren't true. We know aren't true when we're thinking straightly, when we're thinking rightly, and that's exactly what the Israelites do here. So as we think about this complaint, okay, and I just want you to put yourself in Moses' shoes. Okay, can you imagine being in Moses' place? Not just one time, but now since they have been out of Egypt, he has been the target 4 times that are recorded for us in Scripture of Israel's complaints. Again, not just a contingency, not just one family, but the nation is against him. We know their complaints are false and wrong. Moses knew he was in the right. They were in the wrong. But can you imagine facing a people accusing you to your face? Can you imagine people talking behind your back? Can you imagine knowing people dislike you and are at home festering about you when you've done nothing wrong? That is what this leader of God's people is dealing with right here. That's what he's going through. And so now we get the response of their leader. Okay, we've seen his initial response, but there's an even greater response here, and this is in verse 4. Exodus 17:4, we get the response of their leader. It says, so Moses cried to the Lord, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. So it seems simple, it seems obvious, but where does Moses turn? Where does he go? How does he seek to resolve such a situation, these complaints that are being brought to him, these reoccurring complaints of the people he's leading? He goes to God. He goes to God. He turns to God in the midst of those whom he's leading. They're attacking him. They're accusing him falsely. Okay, surely, As I said, he did answer in verse 2 by seeking to have them see their wrongdoing. He tries to address it with them. That didn't resolve things, and here we see his response of crying out to his Lord. Okay, we're told in verse 4, there at the beginning, it says, "So Moses cried to the Lord." Okay, it's this cry to the Lord, what is literally being said here with this word cried, it's a plea for help. It's a plea for help that's being described. We see Moses' struggle in his calling out to God. He's in distress, and again, think of how you handle it when one person accuses you. Just one person, maybe to your face, maybe here it's behind your back, but think about how you handle such a situation. One person attacks you with insults that aren't true. Here Moses dealing with a whole nation going at him, and he cries out to God. We see he's at a loss. Okay, he's at a loss with the first thing that he says to God. If you look again at verse 4, it says, "So Moses cried to the Lord, 'What shall I do with this people?'" He has taken enough. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know a way forward or how to resolve the situation, so he asks God what he should do with this complaining people. Okay, and we further get to see the difficulty Moses was under as he says at the end of verse 4, he says, "So Moses cried to the Lord, 'What shall I do with this people?'" And then here's the difficulty. They are almost ready to stone me. They're almost ready to stone me. They're almost ready to kill me. And we might wonder, was this really a threat that they have given? As we don't have all the words that they said. We don't know exactly what was going on from what's been communicated to us. So was this actually a threat that's been thrown out there? Did he just assume this from the fact that they've said he's trying to kill them and their families twice now? Okay, we can't be sure, but it seems that Moses believes this. Okay, he believes they are almost ready to stone me. He believes his life is on the line in this situation. Moses doesn't know what to do, so he goes to God. We have here a leader in the midst of attack, in the midst of unjust opposition, humbly turning to God for help. What an example for leaders today. Moses cries out to God, and next we find the answer of God. The answer of God in verses 5 through 6. Okay, just think about if you were dealing with such a people. Imagine if you were in God's shoes. Okay, how would you treat this people? If you were God, what do you think they deserve? And we see from God's answer, God doesn't tell Moses to scold them or call them out or dump them, but he will use Moses to graciously provide for them. Okay, and we first see, as we work through these verses, we first see God begins by sending Moses. Moses is sent, as it says in verse 5, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel.'" So the elders would be those who are respected among Israel. Okay, and here they would have a close-up view of what God is about to tell Moses to do. What is about to take place, they could attest to it. And further, thinking back to last week's passage, it said the whole congregation of Israel was complaining, grumbling against Moses and Aaron. These elders most likely were included in that number. But they were to go with Moses ahead of the people. And it wouldn't be Moses' power at work, as we see in verse 5. It says, "And the Lord said to Moses, 'Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel.'" Now it says this, "And take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go." God sends him with the staff that was used in the plagues. The staff that symbolized God and his power was what Moses was to bring along. It would be made clear by Moses using this staff, as we're about to see, it be made clear that this is God. This is God's power that is conducting such a thing. It would remind them of what God had done previously, and even as we think about the timeline, recently in the plagues. And further, they would get to see God providing through his servant Moses, their God-given leader. We further see as God answers Moses here, Moses would not be alone in this public demonstration. It says this in verse 6 as God continues to give instructions. It says, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb." Okay, Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai, or the area that is surrounding Mount Sinai, which we're going to see in the weeks to come is going to be a focal point of this narrative. But we're told here that along with this staff that would symbolize God's power in the plagues, along with Moses went the elders. We're also told here that God would be there as well. Okay, it says that he would stand before Moses. It says, "I will stand before you," speaking to Moses. It's not made clear here if God would only be visible to Moses, if all would be able to see him. But what we can know for sure here by God saying, "Behold, I will stand before you," is that Moses would be very aware that God is there. God is present with him. God is with him in this. Moses has been opposed. He's been grumbled against. The people even wanted to kill him. But here God stands with him. Life as a leader can be lonely. Think about Moses and what he's dealing with. Moses and Aaron, life can be lonely. Facing opposition and insults and persecution can be an extremely lonely place to be. Hearing God's words to him, Moses is told that he would not be alone. It should remind us, and maybe it does remind us of what God had said way back at Moses' call. I don't think I have it up here, but Exodus 3, verse 12. Might have it a little further down. No, it doesn't look like it. I'll just read it for us. What God had said to Moses at Moses' call, Exodus 3:12, God had said this, "But I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." God began by reassuring Moses, "But I will be with you." But I will be with you. God would be with Moses this entire time that he's leading the people of Israel, and we see this is made clear to him in our narrative. So as a leader faces critique, as a leader faces complaints unjustly and wrongly, God is with and he stands by his leader. We see this here for Moses. What a reassuring thing this would be for Moses in the face of opposition. We see that it isn't only that he will be present, but God would provide. As we see, God would supernaturally provide for the people through Moses. If you look with me at verse 6, Exodus 17:6, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." God is gracious. As we talked about, what do the people deserve? Well, they didn't deserve this, but God is gracious. He doesn't give Israel what they deserve. Israel grumbles, and God gives. Israel sins, and God sustains. Israel deserves a reprimand and a punishment, and God gives them what they were grumbling about. God will work in a way that only he could. As we think about this verse, or think about this section of verse 6, he says, "And you shall strike the rock." So Moses shall strike the rock with the staff, and water shall come out of it. So God's gracious, but he also works in a supernatural way that would show this is God's hand. This is God working through his servant Moses, as Moses would hit the rock and water would come out from it. How exactly? As we think about the people being provided for, as it says, and the people will drink, how exactly they would get this water, all of the people of Israel, how it would sustain them, isn't told to us, but it's made clear that the people would drink. They would get the water they so badly wanted and thought that they needed. So this is the instruction. This is all God giving these words to Moses. This is his answer. This is his response. And we see this leader's response to God's direction. As it says there at the end of verse 6, "And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel." Okay, so exactly what God had told him to do, we just get a short, simple phrase of Moses' obedience. "And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel." God told him to take the staff and the elders and strike the rock, and Moses obeyed. It's so important and yet so difficult for leaders to obey God, to live as he has called them to in his word in the midst of complaints from those who were leading. Moses is an example here of that obedience. But he's also an example of disobedience years later in a very similar situation. Just because you succeed once doesn't mean it's guaranteed that you will again. We need to continue to strive for obedience in these difficult situations. And for this, I just want to take a short detour to the book of Numbers. And we see a similar circumstance, but a tragic change. So keep in mind all that we've seen in our passage in Exodus. Now I want us to look at Numbers several years later. Similar circumstances, but a tragic change. Same complaint, same response from the leaders. Numbers 22 through 6. Just notice the similarities and then I'll point them out. It says this in verses 2 through 6 of Numbers 20. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle?" Verse 5, "And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. So many similarities. This is a different passage, different account, different time in Israel's history, but similar circumstances, similar things go down. We have that word quarreled that we had back in Exodus 17. We have a complaint for no water. We have Israel taking things to extremes. Okay, Israel years later are still complainers. Okay, they've continued on and on and on in this sin. Okay, same place, same situation, and yet they haven't learned, which I think should be a lesson for us. But also as we think about their leaders, Moses and Aaron, they respond by turning to the Lord, just like we saw in the Exodus passage. They go to God in the midst of their distress. So a lot of similarities between these passages, this situation in the Exodus passage that we're in tonight. And God responds, and this is where we come to a few differences, a difference in how to handle things. So a difference in some of God's instructions. It says this in Numbers 20, 7 through 9. "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron, your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle.' And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he had commanded him." All right, so God would provide once again. Okay, and he does say, take the staff. But the instructions here are slightly different, as Moses is to speak to the rock, to tell the rock before their eyes to yield water rather than striking it. So though the staff is there, he's to speak to this rock. And as we think about what we've seen so far so good. As the very end, verse 9, it says, "And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he had commanded him." So obedience. But as we go a passage over, the biggest difference between these accounts is found in verses 10 through 13. It says this: "Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, 'Hear now, you rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock?' And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock." And then verse 12, "And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarrel with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy.'" So God still provides. God allows Moses and Aaron to continue leading for the moment, but they wouldn't continue leading into the promised land. And why? because Moses took matters into his own hands. God told him to speak to the rock, and instead he struck that rock twice with his staff. Moses sought to provide and handle the situation in his own way. He had looked to the Lord, but he decided he would do things his way in seeking to resolve the situation. We see the failure of a leader, that he didn't obey the Lord. The situation was heated. Okay, we can see some of the reasons why he wouldn't. The situation was heated, and Moses and Aaron were probably in great distress. They did go to the Lord for help, but then they did not follow his instructions. They failed to obey how God told them to conduct themselves and provide in this situation. We find here a grave lesson as we compare, as we can contrast these two passages. We find here a grave lesson for leaders in obeying the commands of God as they lead their people, as they lead those who are following them, who are under their authority of obeying, and the consequences for disobeying. And now as we move back to this Exodus passage for the last verse of it, before we look at this last verse, I want to just bring out a few lessons as we think about some of the things we've seen so far. Okay, the first lesson I want to bring out is there is real danger and temptation to fault our leaders, blame them, and complain against them for things that are not their fault or they are not in the wrong for. Okay, we should learn from Israel, as it's been time and time and time again. It's not just one instance, one time they're off, but it's been repeatedly now. This reoccurring sin. We should learn how easy this can be to become a reoccurring sin of ours. How destructive, even as we think about Israel, as we think about all that's going on, how destructive it is for a group in which the leader leads and how hurtful it is. So I'd ask you to consider this evening, who are the leaders in your life? Okay, in your different areas, different walks of life, who are the leaders in your life? Are you complaining about them? Are you complaining about them? Either to their face or behind their backs, at home or with other people. I'd ask you to consider, how have you caused disunity with your grumbling against them? How have you hurt them with your blame and your accusations that were not right? It's easy for us to notice the complaining of Israel against their leaders. You may have even read this section in your Bible reading, heard it taught before, and thought, man, how could they? It sticks out like a sore thumb. But have we noticed our own complaints of this nature? And I'd end this lesson up on the screen by asking you, rather than complaining, how much you be supportive, encouraging, respectful, submissive to the leaders in your life. The second lesson is leaders know that you are not alone in the midst of unjust attacks and oppositions from those you lead. God is with you, and he is there for you to cry to. Is it God you run to or someone else? Do you feel completely alone? Let Moses and God's presence with him be a picture to you of how to go through similar circumstance. And then the third lesson is, leaders, it is crucial that you strive to obey God in the midst of complaints and false charges from those you lead. Okay, Moses shows the difference. Moses obeyed, and then in another similar situation, after even more complaining through the years, he fails to obey, and the results are devastating. Pray. Be on guard. Even when you've succeeded obeying in the past, after you've taken complaints and you've dealt with them well and in a godly manner, be on guard for times to come. Complaining will continue from those you lead. Opposition will not go away, and yet we are called to obey. And we're shown in the scriptures how to respond to such things. And now as we close with verse 7, we look at our last verse, and there's a very important point I want to pull it out as we bring this passage to a close, and it is this. God is the one that Israel is ultimately complaining against. Look with me at verse 7. It says, and he called, this is talking about the end of, after all that has taken place. It says in verse 7, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel. And this is the part I want us to zero in on. And because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Okay, this place is the first part of this verse talks about, it's been memorialized for the people's opposition against Moses. And then there at the end, what the people of Israel had also been saying. It hadn't been made clear. There was a few hints in our passage, but it is made clear here as to who they also were complaining against. It wasn't just Moses, but it was God. Okay, we've seen hints of this. Exodus 17:2, we're told this, therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? Why do you test the Lord? Nothing more was said here in verse 2, so that's why I've waited to the end to mention it. Nothing more was said here, but now here at the end in verse 7, we're told of how they were testing the Lord. They were asking the question, is the Lord among us or not? Is God really with us in this difficult situation, this barren land? Is God really still providing for us? God wasn't giving them what they thought they needed or what they wanted in this situation, so they questioned if he was even around, if he was even present. And the amazing thing is, if we go back to the start of this passage, back to verse 1, God is the one who led them to this barren land. God is the one who brought them to a place without water. He intentionally brought them to such a place, as it says in verse 1. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. God commanded them to go there. As we think about it, the pillar of cloud and fire, still with them. We haven't been told it's gone away. God has commanded them. He has led them to this place. This isn't where they wanted to be, but it was where God wanted them to be. So Israel's complaints boil down to what we saw last week. It's a lack of trust in God. That's true here as well. But we also see here it's a defiance against God and his will for them, wanting what they thought was best and not what God thought was best. It's a very important thing to keep in our own minds as we think about our lives, where we are, what we're going through. As we think about Israel, this isn't where they wanted to be. They didn't want to be thirsting. They didn't want to be in a barren land. But it was where God wanted them to be. And remember how God responds as we think about God's part in this text. God responds to the grumbling, the opposition, even though he's the one that's led them here. He's over it all. God graciously provided. We saw God gave Israel what they didn't deserve in providing water from a rock. What an example for leaders today. As we think about God's gracious providing. What an example for leaders today in graciously responding, serving, ministering to those who complain against us. God is our example. So two things as we close. The first is we see that there is a much bigger issue in this chapter than just complaints against a leader, and that is complaints against God himself. The one Israel really has an issue with is God. Okay, they may oppose God's servants, they may attack him and grumble against him, but it's ultimately God that they're upset with. The same can be true of our complaints. And then second concluding remark is that God may sovereignly lead us individually or as a church into difficult and trying situations. And the question we should ask tonight is, will complaining be our response or trust be our response? So tonight we see examples of a complaining people or the complaining people of God, a leader who responds rightly, that same leader who responds wrongly in the future, and a God who is over it all, orchestrating all the events and also treating his grumbling people with grace. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you so much for these passages that are right in a row, that we get to see a reoccurring sin within the lives of the people of Israel, a sin that is very easy for us to notice. in Israel, a sin that is very easy for us to point out and even think, how could they? Coming off the plagues, coming off the dividing of the Red Sea, but yet, Lord, this is something that we easily fall into, grumbling, complaining, and we don't even realize that we're doing it. Lord, I pray that you would convict us this evening, that you would show us where this is at in our lives. Lord, that you would direct us and remind us of the fact that you are with us, you are leading us, and we should trust in you, and even just trust in your will, Lord, knowing that you are the one that sees all, you know what is best, you know the big picture. And Lord, rather than defying your will and where you've brought us in life, things that we would be tempted to complain about, to give thanks for your leading, even if it's a difficult situation, to give thanks for where you brought us in this life, what you've provided for us, and how you will provide in the future. Lord, I pray that you would help us in these passages to learn how to look to you, even as we think about leaders and Moses' example of crying out to you as his God. Lord, I pray that as leaders, we would come before you when people are at us, opposing us, that we would come before you and bring it before your throne. Lord, help us. Help us to be people that trust you and submits to your will. And in your name I pray. Amen. Thank you for joining us this evening, and you are dismissed.